want to call to order the Strategic Planning Committee meeting of Monday, June 28, 2010. And the invocation will be led by Councilman Valentine, followed by the pledge.
Certainly, before we lead in prayer, we want to recognize and also remember the Loop family who lost Roland this past week, and also our parish president, Tommy Martinez, and his family for the loss of their brother Milton. Father in heaven, we ask you to bless us, Lord, tonight as we try to do the people's business. Father, we ask you to comfort each of those families that I mentioned to you, Lord. Father, we ask you to bring them peace amongst the agony and sadness that they are feeling. Father, we ask once again that you guide and direct us, and as always, Father, we ask you to protect our troops, Lord God, and people that are in harm's way. We ask all these in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, Councilman Thompson could not make it tonight. And comment period, anyone wishing to speak on any agenda item can do so. Just let Mr. Zahn know. And then we're asking to amend the agenda. Martha had something that we need to put on there for agenda item number 4, the resolution of ratifying amendments 1 through 4 within RCS. She has item number 5 to be added.
Motion.
Second.
Motion by Councilman Coolidge, second by Councilman Johnson. Any discussion? Further discussion? Any objections? All right, that will be added on to as part of agenda item number 4, which brings us to that resolution ratifying amendments 1 through 5 to the NRCS and Parish contract. Martha?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This is a housekeeping item that we have on here. It was strictly just an extension on the date of the contract. And I would ask that you move this to the full council for ratification of these dates, please.
Motion.
Motion by
Second.
Mr. Coolidge, second by Mr. Valentine. Martha, we're just asking for an extension.
These were extensions, and it was an oversight that we didn't bring it in. So this is just dates that we extended our contract with NRCS through different items.
And
of
what
the,
was the project?
the wastewater debris pickup
Okay.
with drainage.
Okay.
That brings us through July.
July the 31st will be the end, and I hope I don't have to come up here again.
Okay, well, that's great. Any further discussion, any questions? Any objections? So moved. We'll send
Thank you.
that to the full council.
Full
Martha.
council for recommendation.
Mr. Zahn, will you put that on the council? Number 5, reapportionment. Mr. John Diaz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, council
Just
members.
as an introduction, John is a consultant, and he has been hired by the parish to give us some guidance on the reapportionment, which comes up every 10 years, and to justify the moving of the voting districts within the parish. So the floor is yours, John. Give us some.
Thank you, sir. I want to apologize. I originally had a PowerPoint for you, but it was on an Apple, and we tried to make the conversion to a PC. We lost some of the quality, so I don't think the presentation you see on the screen is going to be real clear, so you do have printed out copies that I think will be easier to read and follow, so just so that nobody loses track. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that this would be my 3rd cycle, started redistricting in 1990, drawn districts at the national level as well as the local level, and I've never drawn districts for an organization where everybody ended up happy. So everybody now needs to brace for it. Think of the most contentious political battle you've ever been in, square it and multiply it by 10. That's about what this will end up, particularly in areas where you've had high growth, a lot of shift in population, a lot of things that will be moving. What I'm going to do, and if I'm not mistaken, I think George, maybe you and Adrian are the only two that have been through a redistricting cycle. Is that accurate?
I've been through two.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with, slide 2, which is essentially redistricting 101. And what I have here is the Tier 1 principles of redistricting. These are, in essence, the two criteria that you have to follow in order to be to have your plan pass Justice Department approval. Tier 1 is obviously one man, one vote. That's the whole concept behind why we redraw districts. When the numbers are released, you'll take the parish's total population, you'll divide it by your number of council districts, and that'll be your ideal population size. You're allowed to deviate plus or minus 5% from that number. The second critical criteria is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This deals with the dilution of majority voting strength. In essence, if you have 2 minority districts today, unless you've had a substantial decrease in your minority population over the last 10 years, then your plan needs to have 2 minority districts when it's submitted to Justice Department. And essentially, these are 2 criteria that if you don't meet both of them, it's dead on arrival, and so it's critical. I have Tier 2 criteria here, and just before we even get into them, even if you get an A plus 100 on all 4 of these criteria, and you just deviate from one of the first tier, it's dead upon arrival. I mean, essentially, these are things that are nice. Tier 1 are things that are absolutely necessary. Obviously, the first one is compactness. Essentially, they want you to draw your districts as compact as possible. The interesting thing about this particular component is the court system has never issued any kind of standard of what defines compactness. And so it's a very subjective term. And if you look across the country at different districts, it's like, you may see a district and wonder, how did that survive? Well, they probably had to draw this weird district in order to meet the first 2 criteria, one man, one vote, and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Contiguity is the second one. Obviously, our districts have to be contiguous. They cannot be contiguous by a point, so we need to make sure that we're conscious of that. Communities of interest, once again, the courts like to see that, but they have not clearly defined what a community of interest is. And then also, the fourth criteria is they like, at all possible, to maintain the core districts. Meaning, unless you have a really good reason to go in and entirely change districts and entirely redraw districts, they prefer you send your districts as close to the core districts that they started with. Long story short is move the existing districts as little as possible, but make sure that you meet Tier 1 criteria. Let me give you a quick overview of some of the population numbers. And I talked to you earlier about the ideal population size, and just kind of walk through history here. In 1990, Parish's population was 58,822. Our 11 council districts, the ideal population size was 5,300. By 2000, our population had grown to 76,000, which increased our ideal population size in 2000 to 6,966. And based on the most recent census estimates of 104,000, the ideal population district should be around 9,500. Now, obviously, I think most people on the council and most people on the strategic planning board thinks that number is going to be much higher than that, and I agree with them. But this is the most recent reliable number we had. I can go back and make some adjustments, and we'll talk about that a little later, to build some models reflecting 110,000, 115,000. The data's already been compiled. We just go in and insert what we think is the total population, and it will automatically redistribute it down to the precincts, which allows us to then add it back up to the council districts. I want to look at slide 5 real quick. I talked about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We have 2 minority council districts now. In order for us to change that from 2 to 1 or go from 2 to 3, we either have to have a substantial shift in the minority population. This chart makes it pretty clear that there has been none. In 1990, African Americans represented about 22% of the population, and in 2009 they represent 22 as well. So we should plan accordingly, that there will be 2 minority council seats. Also broke this down regionally, because I think this is where we're really going to run into some problems as far as contentious nature. There's obviously been a pretty drastic shift in the parish's population. If you look at 1990, the West Bank represented close to 20% of the parish's population. By 2000, that number dropped to 14. According to the estimates and the method that we use to disallocate those numbers, it's closer to 12%. This is using formulas. The difference when you use formulas and you use actual counts is that certain communities are much more difficult to count. For example, I think in in Ascension Parish, 70% of everyone returned their census count. In New Orleans, it was 36. So they actually have to deploy people out there to go count. You inevitably lose certain people when you do that, when you go out and you have to manually count them. So it's very possible that when Donsonville's final counts come in, it could be closer to 10% of the parish's population. Now also too, and we always historically refer to the population in Ascension as West Bank versus East Bank, and I'm almost convinced now, particularly when we're talking about population, that we almost have to break it into a tri-region area. Essentially what I did was I created what I call a North Ascension region, and basically if you were to take Highway 74 from the eastern part of the parish and just draw an imaginary line all the way across through Santa Maria, I've identified that as North Ascension. Everything south of that line and to the Mississippi River is what I refer to in these graphs as central, and then obviously everything west of the Mississippi River is the West Bank. You can see there's been a pretty substantial shift there as well. Once again, in 1990, Donsonville represented 19% of the parish's population. The central region, which is the greater Gonzales region, represented 39%, while the North Ascension represented 42%. Fast forward to our estimates. Once again, Donsonville is at 12% of the parish's population. Central is at 36%, and the northern part is well over a majority of the parish's population. So once again, relative to redrawing districts, that's going to impact a lot of the decisions we have to make, and it's obvious that a lot of our districts will now have to begin to move north in some way, shape, or form. What I did with this last chart and the council districts, once again, this model was built off our parish having 104,000 people, which is the latest census estimates. Just to kind of give you an idea of how I arrived at these district-wide numbers, the Census Bureau only releases numbers at the parish and county level, so they give us the total. What we came up with is a method to somehow take that total aggregate number and disallocate it back down to the individual precincts. Essentially what we took is the 2000 copy of the voter file and the most recent copy of the voter file. One method was, for example, George, 23% of all new addresses, the addresses that exist today that didn't exist in 2000 are in your district. So we were able to take that percentage and allocate the total growth. So for example, if there was 10,000 new people in Ascension from 2000 to 2009, we'd allocate 23% to your district, or actually to the precincts in your district. We then went back and smoothed over that because every address is not equal. For example, if I was to take a sample of addresses from Shadow Creek subdivision and a sample of addresses from Pelican Point, those 10 houses in Shadow Creek are probably going to produce twice as many people, total population, than those addresses in Pelican Point. It's a function of life cycle. Most people that move into Pelican Point, even though it's a lot of houses, don't bring kids with them. In fact, that's part of the reason they can afford to move into Pelican Point. Whereas you go to and we had this problem when we were drawing districts, everybody thought, certain communities were going to be the way to fix everything, and you go into them and there's no students. So we used the school board data, and they was gracious enough to let us use it, to come up with a person per household type count in each district. So I was able to smooth over using those two databases to come up with these results. Now the thing you need to know is that even though some of these districts show that they're short on population, that does not indicate that you've lost population. In fact, the West Bank has actually gained about 300 or 400 people. The function, what it is they haven't grown as fast as the rest of the parish. And so, for example, when you look at districts 9 and 10, it's not a function of them losing population. In fact, they've grown quite well when you look at the state average. You just haven't kept up with the Prairieville, Geismar, Dutchtown area. Some obvious things that you can see from some of these districts and things we need to begin considering is obviously, first and foremost, is districts 1 and 3. At the end of the day, these districts will have to be retained. If you look at District 1, which is Oliver Joseph's district, I'm showing right now that he's going to need about 2,000 people in order to be solvent. Since he is one of the minority districts under Section 5, we can't just go get those 2,100 people anywhere. It's got to be certain areas that we pick them up. Also, obviously, Adrian's district, which is District 3, it's down about 1,200. So at some point, we need to begin to figure out where we go to make these districts solvent. And the thing you need to really be conscious of, too, is you got to think about this as a domino effect. Some of you guys may have a district that's within deviation, so you think you're fine and redistricting won't impact you. But once Oliver finds 2,100 people, he's got to take them from somebody else. And for example, Ken, if he takes them from you, you're now down 1,500. If you take them from Cullen, then he goes down from 26 to 36. And then Cullen's got to take them somewhere, and all of a sudden, you know, so at some point, some really tough decisions are going to have to be made about where we go into certain areas and how we do it. And obviously, that's what makes this process so contentious. And with that, guys, I can go back and do these projections based on any number that you think is the idea, you know, the population of the parish. And I was talking to Benny before, he thinks it's closer to 125. I can go back and put that number in here. The formula is the formula. It just sets up my ratios. If you guys want to play with some different numbers just to get an idea of what's going on. The thing also I would, you know, the big caveat about dealing with projections, they are projections. In fact, they're projections based off of projections. The Census Bureau is not always right with their projections, and so we took their projections and using real hard data that we had available, actually inferred those projections down to a more local level. The thing is, guys, look at this as a directional and a magnitude approach. For example, George, I know your district really needs to lose a lot, but don't sit here with Benny and say, all right, you can have these 3,500 people, because until the real numbers are out, we don't really know where 3,500 people, you know, exactly what that encompasses. So I would caution you guys from going down and sitting down and making hard decisions as to where lines are going to be drawn until we actually have the numbers. And with that, I'll take any questions that you guys might have.
John, what is usually the process, let's say from this point, a timeline for things to happen? Let's establish that first.
Yeah, fortunately, well, I guess maybe it's not fortunate, but Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky, and I think parts of Virginia and New Jersey all have elections in 2011. So our data will be released first, because we actually, you as well as the state legislature, will have to draw districts in 2011 that you then again run in 2011. The other states have the comfort of having all of 2011 to create districts that they run in 2012. So the timeline will be short and truncated. We need to probably begin to sit down and talk about direction and where you want to go, so that when the numbers are released probably in late February, and like I said, we'll be first, that we can come up with a plan, bundle it for justice, get it to them, because they can take 60 to 90 days to approve a plan. The longer we wait, the closer we are to qualifying before we know if we have districts or not. And the thing is, this is not new. We had to do this in '91, and turn around and run again that same year. So it can be done. It has been done. But I would think that probably where I would take this next is have individual council members begin to meet with each other, discuss options. When I've done this in the past, I would sit down with each individual guy and decide, look, we know you have to lose. We don't know exactly how many people, but we know it's a lot. Show me some areas that you're open to giving up. And so when we start building, not the plan, but just some ideas and some concepts of what direction people are willing to go, I think it makes, once the numbers come out, the process a lot faster. So, for example, once the numbers are released, you'll probably within a day, I'll have you exactly your ideal populations. We'll have the maps at the precinct level, and we can actually sit down and start drawing. The timeline from that point depends on how fast you guys can get 6 votes to pass a plan that respects the 2-tier principles of redistricting, which is sometimes a time-consuming process. But then again, remember, as soon as it's done, it has to be bundled, sent to justice, and it'll take 60 to 90 days for them to approve it. Now, here's the good news. There's only 5 states that will be submitting plans in 2011, so it's not like the Justice Department is going to be looking at 3,200 county plans across the whole country. They'll be looking at just a select few states, so it's not like it's going to take the full 90 days. They should be able to expedite them and get them back to us pretty quick.
Yeah, John, just basically recapping, you saying that the 2 minority districts definitely need to have their rights fulfilled
Yes.
first, and a good look at that.
Yes.
And whichever direction they end up pushing in, then everybody else is kind of moving around from that.
Correct.
Okay. And what happened the last time? How long did that take? Could you talk about the day that we get the numbers?
Yeah, see, I was in D.C. in 2000, so I'm not in Georgia. You know how long it took you guys to?
Took a while.
But see, you had more time as well, because you guys got the numbers in 2001. You're not running again, I think, until 2003. So you had time. Now we don't, for the most part. We have to move pretty fast. So, but yeah, I can remember '91 when I worked with Dr. Ware doing the school board. It was contentious.
Right. Well, one of the benefits is the school board database. You mentioned that earlier, and you can pretty well because of the, I guess, the definite data that they essentially have, you can pretty much project your numbers to fairly close to what we got.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, this is not a strategic planning committee decision, but I mean, I think Randy may have touched on it, but it's almost like, Kent, since y'all nestled in between the two minority districts, you really got to solve that problem first and make sure that that is solved before you essentially can move on to the rest of the parish, because that makes it has an effect. For instance, in the Geismar Dutchtown area, I have a small amount of minorities, but probably need to retain those to have some. You can't just move into Geismar and take those minorities. You got to balance it out.
Yeah, and the other thing you got to worry about a lot of times is say, well, there's a little section, but if you have to pick up 2,000 whites in order to get to 500 blacks, you really didn't do yourself any good. And so sometimes it's the location and the proximity of them. For example, if you take 74, basically, and then go south on Burnside, and you kind of take that petrochemical area and the West Bank, that's where about 67% of our minority population lives. And so we're kind of tied to making those districts or building those districts in that area, and it's really tough to get to a lot of other areas where, it's just, that's problematic.
It's really the middle of the parish is really in out toward the Dutchtown area. I mean, it's really congested, so to speak. I guess my question would be too. One thing that was done, there was some precincts that were created, and you looking over the data, John, do you see a problem? I know there was a push from the registrar of voters that we needed to split a bunch of precincts, what have you, so that we could come up with some feasible numbers for every district. Do you see that?
At this
we
point,
possibly
I would make a decision on whether to split precincts or not, if and only if it inhibited the 2010 election cycle. I'd much rather them release the actual data, us start drawing districts, and then decide which precincts need to be split. That, to me, makes the most sense, because then we're not splitting and then splitting again because our math was wrong.
Right.
So that's how I would approach it. If you have some precincts that are problematic to conduct election in 2010, then you probably ought to go ahead and split them or accommodate that. But as far as making wholesale across-the-board splits, thinking that you're going to be able to facilitate redistricting, it just doesn't make any sense. Why don't you wait to the real numbers and do it then?
Absolutely. Okay.
John, tools available for us to do this.
Yep.
What tools are available and how do we access them?
Yeah, we have the GIS system, which allows you to go in and move any piece of geography you want. You can move whole precincts, you can move census blocks, you can move block groups. You can either come in person and do it, or we're testing the Go to My PC, where I can actually email you a link to my computer, and you can do it from your office, and while I'm on the phone with you walking through it. So we're trying to make it a lot easier for other people to access it without me having to drive to your office or you drive to my office. But worst case scenario, if that technology doesn't work, then it's just a function of me taking my PC to your location and us.
Probably the best thing is have an initial meeting with you and sit down and go through some scenarios and and really be able to see the details.
Yep.
And then once that happens, then we can all start talking about possibilities that's going to be involved. And so and when can we start? I mean, you have enough data right now?
The data's
to
ready, and it's just projected data, so as long as
Yeah.
everybody's conscious of that, then we can start tomorrow.
And you said the numbers will come in February?
It'll be late
Anticipate.
February.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that each councilman has to realize, it benefits you to take care of this as soon as you can, so I would suggest you won't have a problem dealing with setting up an appointment with John to look at that. And I encourage you to do that, give you ideas, so that he's a professional, and I've been through this a couple of times, and that they can maneuver situations to give you some ideas on what it's going to end up like. And we're going to have to come to an agreement on that and just deal with it. One thing is good, that we all got single-member districts, so you have to deal with dual-member districts like the school board does. So.
And I think, in general, John, can you give a, and I know this is something just for the benefit in general for people, if you could put the map up and just show in general what's going to basically happen. I mean, we know everything needs to move to the northern part.
Mm-hmm.
if you could kind of show that in some way or explain that in some way.
I can show you probably 3 or 4 scenarios.
Yeah.
It's really tough because it's up to 6 guys on the council to decide which way north we go.
Yeah.
Do we go north through Santa Monica? Do we go north through Gonzales and Central? Which you're shaking your head no at the first option. You shaking your head no at the second option.
I'm talking about, we could be here an hour with you throwing scenarios up there. I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
Well,
so,
Saying that
and I'm
it's
just saying.
pure conjecture at this point.
yes.
Yeah, the
Yes.
population shift is coming from south to north.
Yes.
And so, basically, our districts are
Case
going
in
to have
point,
to
if you-
generally move in that area.
If Oliver Thomas takes population from Adrian, because we got the demographic issue, then he takes 2,500 people from Cullen, then Cullen is now short 3,600 people, which there's only 3 districts he can pull from. So it's, which way the dominoes roll, it's hard for me to, I mean, I know they're rolling north, and that's about all I can
Right.
tell you at this point until you guys decide.
Okay.
I guess, back to the time frames and all, it's basically just for everybody that's watching and all of this. We take a look at this, and we're gonna throw some scenarios around before the February 1st, before the date when the numbers, really hard numbers come out. But, based on the 2 minority districts, is that the Justice Department, does that have to be sent in first?
No, they're all sent in as one
It goes
plan.
in with the whole package?
Yep.
All right. Okay.
But once the hard numbers come out, I mean, you pretty much figure you can plan those pretty
Yeah.
quickly. Like I think, like George said, I mean, once those are set, then once the hard numbers come out, you set those, and then you kind of got to play everybody else's district around that.
Right. John, would you want to take 5 minutes at one of the council meetings, the next ones, to just put yourself out there? I know a number of people have not had an opportunity to have any dealings with
Yep.
you, and that way you can introduce yourself to the councilmen that don't know you and let them have the contact information.
Is it just you and Adrian and George that have been through redistricting? Is anyone else on the council?
Maybe Todd.
I'm not sure if Todd has or not.
Yeah. That might be a good idea, just kind of walk through some of the different.
We'd like that, and just arrange with Suzanne the earliest possible council meeting that you can make, and you can give something as an introduction that where we can go, and now we know that. And if you could also put a little summary as to suggestions and do's and don'ts, and where do we go from here,
Very good.
and we'd appreciate that. Any other questions or comments?
This is a true form of politics, and that is gaining a consensus is what politics means. I mean, it's not a bad word. And this is what you got to do, unfortunately, to gain consensus. I mean, you got constituents out there that don't want to lose their councilman. You got some that want to lose their councilman. So, you're going to have some people say, hey, I don't want to lose you. And we start seeing us kind of evolve the situation, but it has to be done. So that's the unfortunate, when you grow, you got to grow
Growing pains.
completely. So, thank you, John.
All right.
Thanks a lot. And Suzanne, you'll take care of that? Making that. All right, thank you very much. Okay, number 6, discussion to amendment to Chapter 11 of Ascension Parish Code of Ordinance, add Section 8, junk and other discarded items, to regulate the storage of junk and other discarded items, discarded or abandoned items. This was brought to us by Councilman Chris Lohr. Chris, you've got the floor.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it, gentlemen. Good evening. Last year, the Strategic Planning Committee passed up through council, as you know, the junk car ordinance, and I think it's time we look at this again and try to expand it and raise our standards a little bit more with regard to trash and refuse. I know I personally, and I'm sure many of you have gotten calls from constituents in the past, and we've been struggling with this problem, and I was kind of surprised to learn that right now, if you're in a subdivision, it's one thing. There's some enforcement we can do there. But really, like, for example, I live on an acre, not in a subdivision. If I wanted to stockpile hordes of garbage and, whether it's a health hazard, what have you, rats, disease, whatever, I can do that, frankly. And there's nothing other than just relying on our code enforcement officials to try to, get people to do the right thing. There's nothing really that they can fall back on. And so this, ordinance, I think we could take a look at and try to put some teeth into it and give them some, something to fall back on. Now, obviously, when you talk about this, it comes down to enforcement, and I think that is a kind of a separate discussion I think we can talk about briefly, but, the point is I think we have to have, first of all, we need to have something that says, you know what, this isn't what we want to do anymore. I think, we could take a look at this from an enforcement perspective with the parish court that perhaps Mr. Shakespeare could give us an update on, but I know that that's in progress, that you guys have discussed that many times here. I think this dovetails very nicely with that. We could, the code enforcement officials could, or, someone could file a complaint, they could check it out, they could run it through that process perhaps. The violations and penalties section here, item A, was simply lifted from the section 1.8 of the code, which, basically is a standard offense if you violate any of the code, any of the ordinances. And Section B, I think, in thinking about it some more today, it's about authorizing Public Works to, basically come on people's property and remove that. I know that's going to be a sensitive issue. I think it would be better perhaps to run this through the parish court if you guys do that and let that person make the decision, let the judge there make the decision about if that's appropriate. I think, though, the point is if there's something that is an immediate health hazard and it's like an abandoned lot, what have you, and you can't, they're not responding to the code enforcement officials, what have you, not responding to the fines. I think there should be some kind of mechanism in place, perhaps, that we could alleviate the situation. But again, this is just here for y'all to discuss, to take a look at, and I just think it's time we raise our standards once again. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, yes, Mr. Cluott.
Yeah, Chris, I just want to let you know that I got something I've been dealing with for about a week, which is actually about the third time dealing with it, that is latest on my way over here. And, it's disheartening to the citizens, the community citizens that are calling, and they're calling DPW, they're calling inspections department, and trying to code enforcement officers and everybody trying to get something done about it. And, we use the term, I guess this has been cliched before I got here, but y'all used the term the junk car ordinance, which, it's been a term to include white goods, whatever. But trash is another issue, and waste and trash and just clean up. And be honest with you, we've been through every scenario, and other than the Board of Health actually shutting somebody's household down, and I'm not talking about abandoned, I'm talking about a place where people are living. That I've had everybody in the parish on this, and there's not a lot of legal moves that we can do to try to help the neighbors with the situation if somebody does not want to be a good citizen and clean up their stuff, for
Right.
their neighbors.
Well, that's why I think we could give this some teeth, and help our code enforcement
And
officials.
I think that's what the intent that Kent had when I first came aboard, that, Kent had, and apparently others before him, or he might have been in on the beginning of it, is that for the, basically what people call the junk car ordinance, but I mean, that, while citizens have rights, you also have responsibilities, and, so there's certain things that are totally out of hand. And though I live in a rural area, and I recognize that a certain amount of people got things, and people will burn garbage or stuff, in the area when they're doing a cleanup. I don't think I have a lot of people around me burning their garbage. It pretty much gets picked up. But the fact is that you got to be a good, responsible citizen to the community, and people do what they got to do. But I have found out through talking to some of the other council members, some of the problems they've had are really, really bad.
Oh, yeah.
That are not in a rural setting, and that really, you have now and then you'll get a citizen come forward to us, and they'll talk about the fact that what's happening next door to them is dragging their property value down. Okay, what's more important than property value is the fact that it's just dragging their neighborhood down. It's causing problems, and for children and things like that.
Right.
So, I think there's something that needs to be in place.
Obviously, within the parish is differences of more urban areas where houses are close together, which is a lot more impacted, and then there's rural areas where you're really not looking to do a lot of enforcement. There's not a whole lot of complaints because it's more or less that what's judged by that is exactly what Councilman Kluat talked about, is property values. And if you're in a rural area and you can have stuff on your backyard and it's covered and people see it, that's fine. That's a whole different scenario than being in a area where houses are close to each other. And that's what we're looking to try to do, try to keep people's property values from going down because of their neighbors, and basically it's a good neighbor deal. It's very frustrating right now. We're working on establishing a parish court for about 4 years now. Ms. Suzanne, I'd like to get an update at the next council meeting from the parish president where we are on this, and when are we going to actually implement it so that we can make this. One of our biggest problems as a councilman is that exactly what Mr. Kluat was saying. You have problems with families not being good neighbors. People get frustrated and they're trying to go to the government for help, and we are not able to help them. And if we had a parish judge that looks at these ordinances and says, yes, this is your fault, this needs to be cleaned up, and here's some incentive to do it, that can get taken care of. And people don't want to go through, and should not have to go in this parish, go through a long drawn-out thing that lasts 6 months or a year to get something cleaned up that shouldn't be there. So that's the intent of what we're trying to do, and hopefully we can get that done. This is something that is just put out here today. We'd like everyone to take a look at it, get some input. Please discuss with Mr. Lower, myself, and we will take a look at any modifications or anything, input at it. And Ms. Suzanne, if you can get it put on the next strategic planning meeting, we'll try to come to a consensus as to what, where we want to go with it, keep it intact or change it, or whatever. Any other questions, comments?
I got one more. Not to second what you said, but the fact is that where do we stand on this court? That I think we've got most of the main things. You guys work real hard. We're hard for a while. We got the main things in place. Is there some legal status or something that's keeping us from doing what
the holdup right now is to get somebody to actually run the court. So
right.
That's Ms. Manda is working on that.
So it's not a budgetary issue or anything
No.
like that.
We have approved any necessary funds. If anything else needs to come to us, we'll be glad to do that. So we're just administrative thing right now.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? With that, we go to item number 7.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Moved by Councilman Kluat, second by Councilman Johnson. This meeting is adjourned.